Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is session 3, Lived Experience, Culture, and Grief. My name is Jessica. I am a member of the GSVLI planning team and staff of the MHTTC Network Coordinating Office, and I am so thrilled to be the moderator of this session and be in rich discussion with Michael, Paulina, and Justin. This session is special and real. Again, it's lived experience. And I want to quickly share that I myself identify as a griever. Exactly a year and a half ago today, actually, on August 24th, 2020, my brother Carlos was killed. He was shot to death at only 24 years old. And so I just want to say that I dedicate this session and our important work here today to him. I have found it so therapeutic to hear others' stories of grief and loss and healing and hope. And through the sessions held yesterday and today, I just feel so honored to be here in this space with you all, and thankful to our lovely faculty, Michael, Paulina, and Justin, who may be grievers themselves with stories and wisdom to share to providers to inform their practices. Michael, Paulina, and Justin will also share what and how we can learn from those with lived experience, different cultural grief narratives, and needs to inform our practice. For their full bios, I invite you to check out the full program. We also offer our GSVLI CV to reference their work. I know my colleagues will place links for those resources in the chat box for you to reference. Before we have Michael, Paulina, and Justin introduce themselves, I'm going to start us off with just a couple of quick housekeeping items for those of you just joining us. Please share your ideas, resources, thoughts, any ideas that resonate with you in the chat box throughout your experience with us today. And please make sure to send what you would like to share with everyone to all attendees and panelists. We welcome you to share what is resonating, connected ideas to the discussion. However, we do not welcome any speech that evokes harm or that is not productive. We welcome your questions through the Q&A box. If you need assistance with any tech issues, please message our tech support team via the chat box. A gentle reminder that all of our sessions are being recorded and they will be available on our event page 2 weeks after today's event. You will also receive an email on how to access those recordings and also access your certificate of attendance. A gentle reminder that you must attend at least 2 hours of today's event in order to qualify for that certificate. And lastly, you can access closed captioning today by clicking the CC button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We also do have some lovely ASL interpreters pinned on our screen for those who may benefit from those services. On that note, I'm going to welcome our tech support team to take down the slides so that we can go ahead and meet our faculty. We'll go alphabetically. I have Justin, Michael, and Paulina with me. Again, welcome. Thank you for being in this space with us. And I'm going to go ahead and invite you to share for 10 minutes who you are, what brings you to your grief work, and what comes up for you when you hear our GSVLI theme, grief sensitivity, where we are now, and where we can go with our practice. Let's go ahead and start with Justin. Hi, Justin.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for attending the session. So my name is Justin Grinage, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Minnesota. My work centers on exploring how curriculum and pedagogy can engender anti-racism. And then previous to that, I was a high school English teacher for 11 years in the Twin Cities. As a part of my introduction for this session, I want to share some of my findings from a research project that examines the impacts of racial trauma on Black youth in a suburban high school. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So this research comes from a combination of two articles that I'll reference at the end of my slides in case you're interested in reading them. I argue that asset-based conceptions of racial trauma can emphasize uh, how the concept of shared traumas can be empowering and healing. So, for instance, what I call collaborative resistance is what three Black youth used to understand their traumas and resist racism, which I'll further illustrate. So, the research context, this was an ethnographic study I conducted at a large suburban high school called Sumner, and that's a pseudonym. All names and places are pseudonyms. It was in Mr. Turner's 12th grade English classroom. This classroom was multiracial. It had 33 students with 17 white students and 16 students of color. I spent 1 year in his classroom observing, participating, interviewing students. And I'll focus on, for this introduction, three Black adolescents, Richard, Frederick, and James. What's two interesting things to note, Mr. Turner was a veteran white teacher, and he was dedicated to discussing racism in his classroom, and he was attempting to be anti-racist. And two, I was what is called a cultural insider, where I had a prior relationship with Mr. Turner and the students in the class. I was their English teacher in 9th and 10th grade. So as a result, there was a lot of trust and rapport built over time. And this aspect made for a rich social environment to study race. My research questions were, how do Black youth make sense of the racial traumas that afflict them? And how do Black youth resist racism both inside and outside of school? The social context is important to bring up for this project. So I conducted my research in 2014, 2015. And over the span of those of 5 months, beginning in August 2014, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and Tamir Rice were all killed. And these public displays of police violence very much haunted students in Mr. Turner's classroom. And certainly we know that these public forms of racial violence have not dissipated since then. So for example, James, one of the Black adolescent students I referenced previously, he explained to me how he deals with racism in his daily life. He said, I think that definitely my guard goes up, and that is because you get scared because of the things that have happened over the past few months, things that happen every day. You get scared and your guard goes up, has to go up. Otherwise, you're going to be an easy victim. So I think just staying aware and being aware of your surroundings is your best option. And so James's response is indicative of the common presence of paranoia and anxiety that many feel in a country where your life can be taken away from you without warning and without question. Students reported that most teachers at Sumner High School refused to discuss, teach, or even mention race in their classroom. And many teachers just simply ignored the police violence that was happening in society. So alongside James, the two other Black students, Frederick and Richard, frequently experienced racism in both inside and outside of Sumner. And I'll just share in their own words some of their thoughts about police violence. So Frederick said, sometimes race won't affect me really. It will kind of just fly over my head. I will notice it, but as far as my emotions, it won't really trigger anything. And then there are times, and it keeps happening, it will have an effect on you. So for instance, when Trayvon Martin was killed, that was like, I seen it and I said, that's kind of messed up. When it happened with Eric Gardner and Michael Brown, and then Tamir Rice, that is when I started taking it kind of hard. And then Richard said, I can't deal with racism anymore. I don't know what to do. I was in the car for Trayvon Martin for that verdict. I didn't know what to do during Michael Brown and Eric Gardner. I didn't know what to do either. This keeps happening again and again. I feel hopeless. I want to emphasize that absolutely they were experiencing racism, but what is most illustrative about their experiences is the ways that they used collective resistance. And so despite not being able to talk about their racial trauma in classrooms, besides Mr. Turner's classroom, all three of these students survived and thrived in school. All were honors students and were leaders in the school community. But in sharp contrast to their embrace of school culture was their critique of how systems and institutions are racialized. They enhanced these critiques by reading books about race. In particular, I frequently saw them reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me and The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. They would often ask me, what are some more good books about race? They all consume these texts as a means for survival. Their awareness of police violence committed against Black bodies motivated them to deliberately and collaboratively read texts like New Jim Crow and Between the World and Me out of concern for their own well-being. These books in particular were likely important to them because Alexander and Coates focused their analysis on the plight of Black youth in America by exposing and critiquing racial violence. I interpreted their engagement with these texts as connected to the explicit violence they witnessed in society and in their own lives. For instance, there was an incident where James was pulled over by a police officer for expired tabs. He was let go without an issue, but it frightened him, severely frightened him. And the next week, I observed that James, Richard, and Frederick all had checked out copies of the New Jim Crow from the public library. They would have conversations like, did you read the part in the New Jim Crow about the school to prison pipeline? We got to talk about that later. That blew my mind. The shared knowledge of how their Blackness was dangerous when viewed through the lens of a white supremacist society underscores their conscious recognition of a we that suffers and a we that is under attack. For example, James said this in describing his awareness of his friends and their racial identity. They, being white people and police officers don't see Frederick as white, he's Black. They don't see Richard as light skinned, he's Black. They don't see me as half Asian, I'm Black. And that is the reality we have to face. I don't even like saying the consequences. Like, I can't walk outside without watching out for a cop. I have to turn my music down when I'm in front of a cop, beside a cop. I see a cop 3 cars in front of me. I turn my music down. I shouldn't have to do that. Yet arising from this shared pain were collective forms of resistance. Working together to thrive in spite of enduring racial trauma became a central focus for Frederick, Richard, and James, their existence both inside and outside of school. Instead of racial trauma signaling a flaw or weakness for them, it needs to be recognized as a highly effective tool for survival and resilience. And this is an important distinction considering the often used discourse of determining Black student underachievement using deficit thinking, where trauma is used to blame students of color for various perceived cultural and racial deficiencies, instead of holding accountable the schools and classrooms that often worsen this trauma. Popular frameworks for addressing trauma in education, social emotional programs such as mindfulness and trauma-informed, often either neglect how racism produces trauma or engage in deficit-based solutions by teaching youth to submit and comply in the face of trauma rather than how to actively challenge racism. This relationship between paralysis in action, harm and healing structures how Black students often are forced to navigate schools, locations where trauma and possibility coexist. But only focusing on paralysis and harm reproduces what Eve Tuck calls damage-centered education that frames students of color as fundamentally broken and traps them into being defined as constantly injured as a result of this trauma. However, experiencing racial trauma also can unlock pathways for agency through the collective awareness of these adverse circumstances, as demonstrated by Frederick, Richard, and James's approaches to contesting racism. And so I'll just end by briefly putting up my contact information and the references to the articles. And I look forward to having great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin, for starting us off by sharing with us those powerful voices of youth and your research on lived experience. Really appreciate that and hope to get to know a little bit more about you and your work and your thoughts on grief sensitivity and your learnings as we continue in this session. Michael, I invite you to share with us now who you are, what brings you to your grief work, and what comes up for you when you hear grief sensitivity. Welcome.
Peace, everybody. Michael Hannon, and it's great to be with you today. I want to extend a shout out to everybody who has had a hand in coordinating this awesome event. To the panelists who are here, I just appreciate being in community with you. I want to share a few things. I want to bring you greetings from New Jersey and Montclair State University, where I'm an associate professor of counseling, and where the institution occupies the land of the Lenape-Hoking, which is the traditional and expropriated territory of the Lenape people who are indigenous to this region of the state and to the country. I want to shout out the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network for coordinating a really dope second annual Grief Sensitivity Virtual Learning Institute. And again, I'm grateful to be in community with you. I'm privileged to be a Black man, partner and husband, father, community member, practicing counselor, and counselor educator who gets the chance to do research and bring my whole self to this space where I can access. And my hope is that I can contribute to and then learn greatly from our time together today. And so in keeping with our panel's theme of lived experience, grief, and culture in the opposite order, I want to share what I'm personally and professionally learning about my own lived experience as a Black cisgender straight man who's married and partnered with 2 children, one of whom is on the autism spectrum. And I need to acknowledge, as you're looking at this slide about the intersection of race, gender, ability, status, parenthood, and grief, I need to acknowledge our foremothers, particularly our foremothers of color, our Black foremothers who continue to give us affirming and insightful language to describe ourselves and our experiences, like Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Gloria Ladson-Billing, Kimberly Crenshaw. You see Angela Davis behind me and Ava DuVernay behind me in my screensaver. As we acknowledge all of our intersectional selves, and within the next few minutes, I'll share the ways grief has been prevalent in my own life and in the lives of men from whom I've learned because we have a shared identity as fathers of autistic people, and then hopefully share some recommendations for school and school mental health and community leaders to engage us more effectively. To Jessica's point earlier, I want to acknowledge today for me is what I call Grandmother's Day, because on this day, in 2019, I lost my maternal grandmother. And then a year later, I lost my grandmother by marriage on the same day, a year apart. And so my heart extends to everybody who's grieving a loss in whatever way and form it's come. I want to share 4 things that I'm learning about Black men in my own experience and in the therapeutic and work that I get to do in the community. I'm learning that Black fathers, and I've been ruminating on this for a little while, Black fathers subscribe to a code. And if I had to articulate the code, the code is to protect, provide, and prepare our children for the world. Protect, provide, and prepare our children for the world. And an autism diagnosis can be the catalyst for a grieving experience, even if it's temporary, because it undermines, or it may feel like, that kind of diagnosis and that lived experience, however real or projected it is, it may undermine our capacity to do those 3 things: to protect, provide, and prepare our children. And the 4 things I want to share with you that I've learned from the fathers and in my own experience is that we grieve a few things when we learn of an autism diagnosis. And for you, it could be another diagnosis that you didn't anticipate, that you didn't expect. The first thing, particularly among Black fathers, that I've learned after having spent years interviewing Black fathers of children with autism and autistic people, is that we grieve the type of relationship we thought was possible when we learn about the diagnosis. We end up asking ourselves, who will our children be as a result of this identity? Who are our children going to be? We likely had very clear, aspirational visions of who our children would be, not assuming that they may be neurodivergent or different from us or differently abled in ways that we conceptualize. And now with the onset of a diagnosis or with the news of a diagnosis, it brings us to this question, who will our children be? That's the first question. The second question is, the second thing that I'm learning rather is, Black fathers, we grieve the way we hoped the world would support and nurture our children, who we thought would be neurotypical, which adds another layer of concern based on our children's race and neurodivergence. We grieve the way we hope the world would receive them, protect them, nurture them, feed them. And when we reconcile the fact that those children will be Black, it puts that at risk, that nurturing, that protection, that affirmation. And when we learn that they're going to be neurodivergent, we know that the world may not be so hospitable to them as well. We end up asking ourselves, will the world be a safe and just place for them, right? The third thing that I've learned about Black fathers of autistic children and people, and the grief that we may experience over time, is that we grieve a loss of our identity, of a particular kind of Black father. This is who I was going to be to my son. This is who I was going to be to my daughter. This is who I was going to be to my child. And the question we end up asking ourselves is really an existential question. We end up asking ourselves, who will I be as a result of this experience? And do I have the capacity to grow from this experience? Or will this experience dictate or influence my inability to move, my inability to re-envision what my life will be with my children who are diagnosed differently or have different abilities, autism or otherwise? The fourth thing that I think I'm learning is that we grieve the loss of community as we rightfully anticipate more extreme othering. I've learned over time in therapeutic settings, in educational settings, as a former school counselor, as a current clinical mental health counselor, as a current professor, that if spaces don't say that they are explicitly for Black people, then it's for white people. If spaces don't say they're explicitly for Indigenous people, then they're for white people. And if spaces don't say explicitly that they are for autistic people, then they're likely for neurotypical people. And we grieve the loss of the community we might rightfully anticipate because we're anticipating being othered in another way, not just by our race, not just by our children's race and ethnicity, but by their ability status. And so we ask ourselves, with whom can I connect to negotiate and reconcile this new reality? Who can I connect with? Who can I connect with? Because we know we're going to be othered. If you're a sports fan, particularly of basketball or football, you might know that playbooks are essential to the successful competition. And many times fathers have expressed to me in interviews, in group work, they're looking for the damn playbook. Where is the damn playbook to be able to negotiate this time? And how do I make sense of it so I can be the right kind of help for my children, so that I can prepare, protect, and provide for them in ways that I've been socialized to do, in ways that I know they deserve. And so there's a saying that I have in my house about being the right kind of help. When we're doing things around the house, let's say I might do a real crappy job of washing the dishes. And my wife or my kids will say, Dad, you're the wrong kind of help. You need to be the right kind of help. And what I want to share with folks who are in community with us today and in space with us today is encourage us to continue to be the right kind of help, the kind of help that affirms, the kind of help that supports and acknowledges. And so to all of my school mental health, community mental health, and everybody who's in this space who are leaders and have some level of influence, and that's everybody, I know you understand the importance and the utility of group work, group therapeutic work. And I'm reminding you, if for some reason you forgot, it can absolutely be transformative. I encourage you to consider how group work can be a conduit for healing and the healthy processing for grief that some fathers, particularly those fathers with marginalized identities, experience as a result of an autism diagnosis or another label or another identity. There's plenty of research that reminds us of the benefits of group work. And for the last 2 years, I've been fortunate to co-facilitate a support group for dads of kids with autism. We've literally gone from the Philly metro region from where I live. And because we've gone virtual as a result of the pandemic, we're engaging men from across the country and in some instances across the world. It's a growth-oriented group that's diverse in race, that's diverse in ethnicity, that's diverse in faith, that's diverse in ability, and it continues to grow. It provides an opportunity to really engage with these fathers in ways that they aren't being engaged anywhere else. And it continues to grow. It's become a place where the fathers can be candid enough to reveal, learn, and share dimensions of themselves within the group, so that the practice of doing it in the group extends itself to happen outside of the group, recognizing it takes some courage to do that. And so my suggestion and my recommendation is for those of us who are in community with fathers, Black fathers, Indigenous fathers, Latinx fathers, Asian fathers, white fathers, fathers who may be confronting a grief experience or grieving a loss in whatever capacity that loss came to them, connect those fathers who might be grieving so that they can feel engaged in a community with a shared identity. And then they can exercise the courage and the bravery to share with you and other folks in their world beyond those groups. I appreciate your time and attention. Peace, y'all.
Wow, Michael. Thank you for sharing your learnings and your wisdom with us. I see several comments for you in the chat, many who are appreciative of your acknowledgement of children on the autism spectrum. It was so important for us to have diverse representation and identities in these important conversations today. So thank you again for being here and for your willingness to share this space with us today on your special Grandma's Day. My heartfelt condolences to you. And last but not least, Paulina, please know that I am such a fan of your work, and I feel so honored to welcome you and ready for you to share with us who you are and what brings you to our grief work and what comes up for you when you hear grief sensitivity.
Well, first of all, those, Justin, Michael, chills everywhere. I'm so grateful that we're in this space, and Jessica, thank you so much for those kind words. You know, my name is Pauline Almarosa. I am a licensed clinical social worker in the state of California, but that is not the label that is the most important one, nor is it the only one. I am also what I learned this later was a grief archivist, a storyteller, a mother, and a creator of spaces that allow for folks to really share their grief. So true to my label, I want to start by sharing my story. And I do this because I am a clinician, and I have found in my work that we ask a lot of people that we serve. We ask them to share their most vulnerable moments. We ask, and we take, and we extract. And we so rarely give them anything back of ourselves. And I tell everybody that I serve that therapy is built on a foundation of trust. And without that trust, then we're not going to be able to withstand some of the hard things that are coming. And so my hope is that by sharing my story, that we can develop a foundation that can be built on, not just today, but as we move forward. The picture that you see on your screen was taken in Cuernavaca, Morelos, Mexico. That is my birthland. This is one of the few pictures that I have of my brother and my father and I together. Picture was taken, we had a picnic, we played, it was a wonderful day. And then life continued, and there were so very few opportunities to take any more pictures together. Shortly after that, we immigrated to the United States. And when we arrived here, there were wonderful people who met us, but we were also met with a ton, I know, not academic, but a ton of unexpected trauma, discrimination, racism, illness, incarceration, poverty, and tremendous loss. And some of the people in the picture sadly did not make it. My father, after having worked his entire life in hard labor, died of lung cancer and undocumented in 2015, 2 weeks after I graduated from UCLA. And my brother is currently incarcerated and has been for a number of years. And I share this with you because we are the carriers of our stories. As a child, as a teen, I remember living most of my life with a suitcase ready to go because I just didn't know when there would be a knock on my door and we would have to leave. I used to live in this constant motion of goals and graduations and promotions, and that's what we push our children and our youth to do. We focus so much on the goals and the success and the accolades that sometimes we forget to ask, what is happening at home? So for a long time, people kept telling me that I was so successful and that I was so great, and I never believed it. I thought I had failed miserably. And later I learned that I wasn't alone in my guilt. And after I began my healing work and then engaging with folks through being a therapist and through community work, I heard my story recounted hundreds of times. Of course, different circumstances, but the themes are all there. That grief left unaddressed is carried through generations, and grief left unacknowledged will fester. And grief that is dismissed and ignored builds shame. So today, I hope that through this space, I can share some of the wisdom that, again, does not belong exclusively to me. It is a wisdom that I have acquired through decades of lived experience of a career in mental health, where I've served people in detention centers, in community centers, in schools, hospice, Skid Row, you name it, I've probably been there. But all of that really led me to acknowledge that we needed to have spaces where people could come and share their grief. So I founded Latinx Grieve, and you can check it out on Instagram. There's a website coming soon. And that is a space that really honors the memory of those who I believe and know die invisible and unjust deaths. And so that is a part of how I honor that. And then in 2020, I founded, couple months later, I founded Counseling Contigo, which is my private practice, where I hope that I can bring hope that healing is possible. I have another screen. I think I have a few minutes. So I would like to share now a little bit more about what came up for me when we were, and I was reflecting on my story, and I was reflecting on all the people that I've served, all of the people that I'm currently serving, on our youth, on myself as a youth, on what could have been done. Somebody mentioned having a playbook. I went through my playbook and I was like, where did the plays go wrong? Like, I am not a sports person, so I'm probably not making sense, but I was like, where did things kind of start to fall apart? And I think that when I think back on my experiences and the people that I've served, and then now currently, and somebody said this in the previous webinar, we need to be inclusive and affirming that there is also a wide range of non-death losses that are impactful and that bring about just as much pain and suffering as a death losses. There is a term called disenfranchised grief, called the hidden sorrow. And those griefs are not usually talked about. They're shamed, they're stigmatized. Incarceration is one of them. And that one's a close and dear one to my heart. Immigration is another one. Those are the griefs that we don't want to touch, but those are the griefs that we need to touch more. And we need to be in space with them a little bit more. I think about curiosity. I think about how many people didn't ask me about my story or my culture or what my language was or how I grieved or my foods. I had a conversation recently with someone and I asked them, what language do you speak? And that conversation brought about so many insights for that person about their grief that never probably would have come out if we had not opened up the door of language. And so I think that we need to get into expanding how our curiosity operates. And it needs to include all of the factors that influence a person, both individual, socially, culturally, and systemic. And the last thing is compassion and honesty. If we cannot be honest with each other, then there is no trust. And I saw that when I worked as a youth and family and child therapist for many years. And I spent so much time building trust. And I did that by being honest about what my role was, about what I could offer, what I could not offer, what they could expect, what was, as much as I could predict what was coming. We need to create safety. And we, above all, need to extend compassion Compassion is not the same as empathy. Compassion is an action. It says, I see you. I know that it's hurting, and I am going to stay by your side, and we're going to figure it out, and we're going to do this together. And I think that when we bring all of these, I like to think about food. Maybe I'm just a foodie, but I think if we mix all of these ingredients in this big pot of grief, I think we have a pretty good recipe for opening doors and seating more people at the table who need to be sat with us and not in othered, as somebody said, othered. And so as we move forward, I hope that this resonates, and I really do hope that we can have more spaces like this. And I thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Paulina, for your strong, strong voice. So much there for us to reflect on, and so much that I personally can resonate with. I know that your posts on Latinx grief on Instagram have really helped me throughout my journey, my own grief personally. And so I'm glad that my team has been so quick to plug in those links to your Instagram and your other pieces of work on our chat box so that others can have access to those as well. Really, thank you all for such a meaningful share of where we are and where we can go in our grief sensitivity work and your own experiences. I really want us to explore some more specific questions around lived experience, culture, and grief. I know that we may not get to all of them. They are rich and complicated, but also very much needed, like your work. So we'll start off with our first question. How might lived experience inform the way that you provide grief wisdom?
Should I go first? We're going to keep the order.
Yes, feel free. No, anyone can jump in at any moment, but I invite you to get us started, Justin.
All right. Can you repeat the question one more time, Jessica?
Yeah, how might lived experience inform the way that you provide grief wisdom?
Okay, so I'll just continue to speak in the context of schools and classrooms, since that's where my work emerges from. But for me, as a former teacher and a current teacher educator, my lived experience as a Black man, but then in particular as a Black former teacher and former student in K-12 schools, I draw from those experiences, especially when I'm trying to work with teachers to become more culturally responsive and anti-racist. And that's because Michael Dumas has the term schooling as a site of Black suffering. And basically, he talks about how schools actually exacerbate the racial traumas and doesn't necessarily allow us to grieve. Schools largely have been spaces where grieving is deterred, is not even recognized. And so for me, in relation to sharing my lived experiences, and I would say especially with pre-service teachers of color, those folks wanting to be teachers, whenever we have our shared bonds over like how we've suffered in schools, that's contributed to us being able to recognize the ways in which we can help our students potentially grieve and connect with them.
Yes, 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 Justin. I see so many in the chat box also. Speak that truth. And Paulina, I see you nodding your head a lot. I wonder if you wanted to add to that.
I'm just here cheering everyone on. I can listen to stories all day. And so I'm just grateful. And I want to say that on that sentiment, I think we ignore grief, lived experience so much, and we tend to think about it as not valid and not valuable. But isn't that where most of our data comes from? It's from lived experiences. And so I think that if we take the time, lived experience can be a source of wisdom and knowledge that can then open up other ways to serve folks, right? So the idea that we ask about language, that came from lived experience of my own and other people in my communities when I started to ask, you know, what does your grief look like? What does it, where is it rooted? Where does it live? And across the board, and children used to say that too, right? They'd say, I can't tell you what this means in English, but I can tell you in Spanish how I feel, right? And so that lived experience for me has been gold. I cherish it, I mine it, I love it, because that is where I think we're gonna root ourselves.
I mean, I think I hope I'm I'm offering something here. So appreciative of the insight of not just the panelists, but the folks who are weighing in on the chat. I think I think our lived experience can inform the way we provide grief wisdom by doing the things that this conference is doing. It's actually giving it a name. And there are practitioners, clinicians, mental health, spiritual advisors who literally operate assuming that every presenting issue that we name is likely based on a loss, which yields the grief experience, the expression of grief. So that could be job related, that could be relationship oriented. My pet may have just transitioned, or my grandmom just made transition. If I'm experiencing a loss, then it's appropriate to assume, it's developmentally appropriate to assume that I'm going to grieve. And if we in community can give folks the language to say, yo, you might be grieving the loss of your job. You might be grieving the loss of having to make a career change right now. Yo, you might be grieving the loss of having to watch Black and brown children get executed by the police. Right? So it's doing what this conference suggests we do. It's giving it a name and giving folks permission to say, I'm grieving. And maybe that's a long way of indicating that folks, the social structures, just like Justin and Paulina have said, our social structures don't give us permission to grieve. We're not allowed. It's not socially acceptable. And whatever way it comes out, it's not socially acceptable. And when it is socially acceptable, somebody else has usually written the script. And if somebody writes a script in a language you don't talk, then guess what? Then I'm at a loss. So I appreciate the question. Hopefully that makes sense.
Makes total sense, Michael. And I see the chat box just like lighting up when you speak. And, you know, you said, I hope I have something to add. You are definitely adding a lot to this conversation. And just to kind of expand on that a little bit, I wonder if Justin or Paulina have something to add about how might our sociocultural or political structures in our schools impact our access to grief healing. I kind of feel like we were starting to kind of get a little bit on that topic here. And so, Justin, I see you unmuted yourself. I wonder if you have something to add there.
Yeah, I have a quick point. So a pattern that I've been seeing in education is the rise in popularity of trauma-informed schooling and social emotional programs. And the point I want to make is that those programs can only be effective insofar as they're not promoting a view of students as being pathologized because of their trauma in ways that disempower them. And so sometimes those programs can turn into, how can we teach students to internally regulate their behaviors and regulate their emotions in a way that allows them to acquiesce to the traumas that they're facing. And so if there isn't an incorporation of specific ways that students can collaborate together to resist, and I'm thinking in terms of specifically racial trauma and racism, but this goes to other forms of traumas too, but how can they collaborate together to resist, to heal, and to find agency to empower themselves. And I think that needs to really be incorporated into these programs for them to be effective.
Having been a school counselor for several years before I became a faculty member, I think about the structure of a student's day, children and adolescents in school spaces, and the structure of the day. And it yields a really important question about what do we make time? And when we're literally asking ourselves, how come our children can't go outside for physical education, health and phys ed? It's reasonable to assume that if there's not time for health and phys ed, then there's not spaces where students can express their grief in ways that are affirming and healthy and accepted. And so the thing I think about is, organizational routine. When I think about educational settings, I think about organizational routines and what happens over the course of the day and who determines what's most important and when. And so that's what I think about with respect to social location and what's happening in school buildings and even in community settings, inpatient hospitals, what's most important and when, and who determines that. And if there isn't time and space to think about my range of identities and the ways that I've experienced loss and the most cathartic ways to express that loss through grieving activities or grieving experiences, then we certainly have evidence of what is prioritized and what's not.
And then for me, I have never been a teacher, but I have worked in schools and I have been a mental health therapist to youth for many years. And one of the things that for me was important was always listening to the teachers and the educators themselves. I think that it's important that, we recognize that sometimes they're overloaded and they're burnt out, and there's a lot of mental health things that are impacting the way in which they teach and they respond. And it's not to say they're not to be held responsible, but it's also opening up that door to teachers to have spaces, for educators to have spaces where they can, talk about what their challenges are, what their grief is, and for them to also maybe share ideas on how to respond and to start modeling those things for children and for youth. And I think it's kind of a tall order, right? But I think even as a therapist myself, like, we're all giving each other therapy at this point, right? I'm giving therapy to a couple of clinicians, and I get my own therapy. It's kind of that idea now that we have to have each other, and we can't forget about the people who are providing the services. And I think sometimes we do, and when there's sometimes a tendency to blame them and to take out our anger and our aggression and our grief on the one person that is there to support, right? And so it's also that is, I think, telling of how we structure schooling and how we structure what we expect out of folks. And so that is my piece, and I hope it resonates.
Definitely resonating, Paulina. And kind of going a little deeper into that, in your perspective, and you too, Justin, Michael, what does the dominant culture miss when it comes to grief? I know you've already named a couple of examples, but I'm thinking about, how many schools might not have, for example, anti-racist grief support for students and staff. And we see so many different situations across the country, especially recently, with police brutality issues and racism against Asian Americans. And I think that, that's definitely something that we want other schools to be able to provide, and kind of make it more of a norm to have these types of services and support in place. But so many schools, don't even have school social workers dedicated to just one school. We're seeing a shortage right now of school mental health professionals and educators. And so, what would you say is, missing? What does the dominant culture miss when it comes to grief?
I think it's pigeonholing it into one emotion and one narrative. It's saying grief is only sadness. So if you're sad, we will attend to you. If you are angry, then that is a dangerous emotion, and therefore we cannot touch it, and it gets pathologized. So I think what's missing sometimes is, like, I think somebody else mentioned it, the vocabulary, to give folks vocabulary and opportunities to learn even just the basics of how do I feel, and what am I feeling in my body, and what is happening, and to have conversations also that address liability head on. We don't talk about liability and how many folks are scared of liability, and how that sometimes interferes with providing services that are culturally attuned, that are honest, that are authentic, and then students feel that, kids know that there's, I don't know if you're safe. It's creating psychological safety for our most marginalized, who have been traumatized, not just in their lifetimes, but intergenerationally. So I think safety above all. And how do we create that? I think it comes with naming things. It comes with having dedicated slots to having conversations, because if you, and I hate to say it, but if you invest the time for an hour to have feeling sad, whatever you want to call it, it pays off, right? It's an investment in that person, and it gives back in waves. So, and I do that in my own home. I have scheduled times to check in with people in my home. How are you feeling? What can we do? How can we support each other? Because otherwise it's so easy to get into routine and ignore, the signs, and ignore the feelings. And that's kind of where I'm rooting that question in.
I appreciate Paulina like bringing up this notion of vocabulary. I think it's really important. And just back in the context of schools, I'm thinking about Megan Bowler, who's a researcher. She has a book called Feeling Power. She talks about this concept, what she says is pastoral power. And basically she says that students from the very beginning of their schooling experiences are continuously regulated in terms of what emotions they feel like they're able to express in a classroom. And especially for Black and Brown students, oftentimes when grief does manifest as anger, that's interpreted in very negative ways in the context of white supremacy, where that anger is being misunderstood in very harmful ways by school staff. And then I was going to say something else. I forgot. If I remember it, I'll say it. But I wanted to make that point.
I think how can the dominant what does a dominant culture miss? And I think in many ways the dominant culture misses or dismisses their influence, right? Like it's one thing if I'm in a room full of Black men who like football, and another Black man who comes in and likes soccer, which is the real football. Another Black man who likes soccer comes into a space, and then I dismiss how influential the football folks are, then it renders the person who likes soccer invisible. And so while that's a very elementary and hopefully not disparaging kind of example or oversimplified example, what I'm saying is what the dominant culture can miss, especially when we're part of the dominant culture or we're agents of the dominant culture, we can miss and be dismissive of how influential we can be. So I encourage all of us, me included, to remember, if I'm in the position of influence, if I'm a member of the dominant group, to ask myself whose voices and whose perspectives and whose lived experiences are missing. I love Paulina's point about liability, and it leads me to leading with compliance versus compassion, right? Compliance is like, this is what we got to do. Compassion says, this is what we're going to do because this is what folks deserve. And sometimes the dominant culture, those who have the most influence, those who feel like they have the most to lose, when we can make some arguments about who has more to lose, they can lead with compliance versus compassion. And the last point I'll make is, what does the dominant culture miss? Sometimes it's rendering folks invisible. I can only imagine how many folks are in this space when they were students and children or adolescents or in their workspaces right now, that if they have a spiritual or religious identity and the organization doesn't acknowledge it. Like I've worked in school districts where they don't acknowledge Islamic holidays and holy days, but they sure as hell will acknowledge Christian holy days and holidays. That is a loss. That's a form of loss because you're rendered invisible. And everybody in your household acknowledges this particular holy day. But the community where I live doesn't even see me enough to acknowledge my holy day, even though other folks deservingly need their holy days acknowledged, like Jewish folks, like Christian folks. But the dominant culture sometimes misses how invisible they can render people when there's not a shared identity. So those are some of the things I think of.
Gosh, every time one of you speaks, I'm just left in awe and feel again just so humbled to be here in this space with you all. I imagine that we have a lot of questions for Justin and Michael and Paulina, and so I want to stop there with our pre-developed questions and move into questions from our audience. I know that we have 2 right now in the Q&A pod, and my colleague Leora was going to share with us a few others from our previous session that had come in that we felt were a good fit to ask of you, Paulina, Michael, Justin, to respond to. So really quickly, let me start with the ones in the Q&A pod. Michael, someone is asking if the Fathers Support Group is open for fathers in other states. And also if you have any advice, resources for autistic students who are grieving.
Appreciate the question. Short answer is yes. The Fathers Group, and I can share information, but if anyone wants to note it, it's on the 3rd Saturday of every month during the academic year. So the next one will be on the 3rd Saturday in March at 11 a.m. Eastern. And I can get you information, I can share information. And so yes, it's open to anybody who wants to come. It is gendered, right? It is for fathers and father figures. And so many times for our hetero brothers and sisters, those wives and partners, those female partners, they'd be like, hey, get your tail to the dad's group because you need to go talk about some of this stuff. And so yeah, but it's the 3rd Saturday of every month. And advice or resources for autistic students who are grieving. I feel bad in some way because I don't know that I have a really specific answer to this in my own lived experience and interviewing and writing about and learning from other dads of autistic children. I think the most important thing that we have to do when we're caring for and loving people who are autistic is just remember to learn their language, right? And that bodes across all kinds of identities, right? But especially when autistic people don't have expressive language in ways that we understand, when we can begin to learn the language of the people who we love and love us, it positions us to be the right kind of help. I did a study a while ago, published in 2014, of dads of autistic children, all of whom had Asperger's syndrome when Asperger's was still a diagnosis. And I was asking about the rewards of fathering because the research is so heavy and saturated with the challenges and the stress and all that, which is a part of the experience. But these dads talked about finding a common language as being the most rewarding way, the most rewarding part of their fathering experience. And so that's one thing I would offer, and I hope it's helpful. It's remembering that we have to learn sometimes a new language for the people that we love. And when we do that and can demonstrate the persistence and commitment to do it, it just opens up plenty of opportunities for us to connect more deeply. So I hope that's helpful.
Very helpful, Michael. And thank you for sharing with us that wonderful resource. That support group link is in the chat box, everyone. Leora has just entered it in there. Please feel free to click on that and check it out. Another question that we have in the Q&A pod, and I welcome, Justin, Paulina, please feel free to also jump in. Can you break down the piece on resistance? For some, it may have a negative connotation. What is the significance of resistance on healing versus alongside resilience? And there's a second part to the question there, but maybe we can focus on that first piece.
I think I've been using that word, so I'll take this. So what I mean by resistance in the context of my study is actually resistance in sort of like an activist sense of the word. I'll give a small and a smaller example and a larger scale example. So the small example, the three Black adolescents that I mentioned, Richard, Frederick, and James, they were honor students, but they were consistently experiencing racism from their teachers. And so their friendships were defined by being collaborative in resisting that racism. And so one example would be they had to take an honors history class. The teacher had a reputation, he was just flat out a racist teacher. But they knew they had to take this class to get the college credit. And initially they were all in separate sections of the class. Like they were in all separate class periods. And basically they're like, okay, we need to be in that classroom together, the three of us, to bond together and resist this guy and help each other. And so they, alongside help from myself and Mr. Turner, who I referenced, we talked to the counselors, we got them all in the same class, and they collaborated to resist the racism from that white teacher. And if I remember correctly, they all got A's in the class. A larger scale example of this is just me still knowing who they are. And all of them have sort of taken up this disposition of activism in relation to what they've done in their lives. And so one's a teacher, one is a emerging politician, and the other one is a PhD student literally trying to cure cancer. And the things that they talk about, still collectively collaborating, is the ways in which they try to incorporate being anti-oppressive within their various careers. And so on a larger scale, their experiences from high school and their friendships together have propelled them to continue on that activism. So.
Thank you so much, Justin.
I don't know if that helped answer the question, but that's just the two stories that came to my mind. So.
No, I appreciate you sharing stories today. I know that there's a second part of the question there that talks about self-regulation. Where does self-regulation shift and move throughout the process? Is there a time where self-regulation steps forward or falls back? I'm not sure if there's enough context there for you, Justin, to respond to.
Okay, I was gonna defer to Paulina or Michael, but okay, so self-regulation. I
do welcome Michael and Paulina to also jump in, but
I'll just say
as a follow-up to yours.
Yeah, I'll say this quickly. You know what I found interesting is like, so, and I don't know if this necessarily relates to self-regulation, but in particular, as I was doing my research project, the students of color in the class were very well versed at naming their grief in terms of like racial grief, naming the harm that racism has done to them. They were very well versed in that. And I was well versed as a researcher in like documenting that pain. Like I just was simply documenting that pain. And I overlooked all of the subtle and nuanced ways that they were actually collaborating together to heal and resist racism. And I think that if students become more self-aware of the ways that they are actually resisting and can enhance this in a collaborative way, then I think that there's pathways for agency that can open up. I think where the self-regulation comes in is school is a site for disempowering folks. And so students often self-regulate in ways that they don't believe that they can actually um, take some semblance of control over their lived experiences, and they become disempowered because of that, and they don't think there's anything that they can actually do to help change the world, even if it's on a small scale. So schools teach students to self-regulate in ways that they acquiesce to their traumas and don't believe that they can actually do something about their circumstances.
Thank you so much, Justin. Did anyone have anything to add to that before we move on to maybe one final question?
I think the only thing I would add, and I appreciate Justin jumping out there on this, when it comes to self-regulation, I'm reminded of an adage that tells me that all behavior communicates. Every single behavior communicates something to an audience or to a person. And so if and when forms of self-regulation are not palatable to the dominant structure, the question that the dominant structure, the people in authority, the people with influence need to ask themselves is, what is this student, what is this client, what is this child, what is this adult attempting to communicate by way of this method of self-regulation? If it gives me discomfort as the person who's in charge or the person who has responsibility, one of the first questions, if not the first question I have to ask myself is, what is she trying to communicate by way of this method of self-regulation? And what is it about this method of self-regulation that makes me uncomfortable? And I think a lot of times it comes down to, for those of us who are in authority or in positions of authority, it comes down to our comfort and being able to wield control. So when Justin talks about acquiescing, I think that's exactly what it is. Schools, institutions, social structures give the proverbial green light to specific kinds of self-regulation. And in other ways, they say, no, that's not welcome here. So I'm always reminded, even in my own family, in the context of my own family, my own children. My children are 19 and 17 years old. But if there's something they're doing I don't understand, I'm saying to myself, what are they trying to communicate? Before I get angry, what are they trying to communicate? And the regulation is one form of communication, and it's telling me something. I have to be committed to finding out what it is that's attempted to being communicated before having a inappropriate response to it.
And I'll just add a quick piece about co-regulating. I think sometimes kids, and children, youth, a lot of us, we grew up in environments, homes, communities where it was survival. And so there's a lot of trauma, and that activates that flight or fight, right? And we're so, and then we're expected to regulate independently, like if we were born knowing how to regulate. And if we look at indigenous cultures, right, and other cultures, children were attached to their moms for a greater part of the first couple of years of their lives. They all slept together. They learned how to co-regulate, and that was through, the other person also doing it with them. And so I think sometimes we place a lot of expectation on an individual to be able to follow through and understand the directives of take a breath and do this, then do that, and and then it all gets lost because it's not natural. It doesn't feel authentic. But when we do it with them, when we're constantly being attuned to our own behaviors, then we model it. And then when we model it, then it doesn't become something that we have to think about in the moment of crisis. It becomes something that is just embedded in how we interact with each other. And so I wanted to say that maybe for self-regulation, right, it has to be embedded in how we communicate and how we regulate each other, not just placing it all, that responsibility on one person.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much. I know that we're getting close to the end of our time together here, but I did want to ask one question that I'm kind of curious about. And Paulina, this is kind of more directed towards you, because you shared with us that your father passed away undocumented, and you shared with us that your brother is incarcerated. And I know my brother, prior to passing away, had been incarcerated a couple of times. And so I definitely, can imagine, how that is having a sibling away. And so I wanted to ask, because I want to, spotlight these two groups, undocumented and incarcerated communities. Do you have any just, a quick sharing of strategies to support undocumented grief and incarcerated grief?
These two topics are actually, they're very near and drive a lot of my work because they're so personal, but also because I've been in contact with them directly, and then also in my work. So I used to work on Skid Row, and our agency had contract with the jails in downtown LA. And I think, just thinking even of my brother, it's back to that idea of not pathologizing emotions that don't comfort us, right? It's about being curious about what is happening to that person. So I would ask, and maybe you heard it, not what is wrong with you, but what has happened. It's the language that we use to approach people that has to be rooted in trauma-informed language, but also in compassion. We have to think about how we talk and what we ask. And it has to come from a place of genuine wanting to understand someone versus just for the heck of it, right? So I'm always very cautious about how I ask a question, and I sometimes allow people to lead first, and I don't intervene. I allow people to be the experts, and because they survived all this time without me, right? So they don't need me. They just need somebody to sometimes witness that. So witnessing is huge. And I would say for undocumented populations, it really does go back to that transparency about the legality. And if we're not versed in it, that's okay. But we need to at least acknowledge that there's a potential for consequences and address those fears with folks. Like, what are you fearing in this space would happen if you were to share X, Y, and Z? And just addressing, like, hypothetically, what does that look like? And so that way, you both are working from a framework that understands and puts out there, this is what we're working with, so let's work off of this context. So transparency with both populations, honesty, and then minding the language that we use and minding where that language was created. So like why am I talking to this person? What shaped the way that I treat this person? What systems are at play? It's a lot of self-work. And it starts with us. We have to go and do that work for ourselves and understand ourselves so that then we can show up for folks ready to offer that space. Human-centered language, yeah.
I'm so glad I had a moment to ask you that, Paulina. Thank you so much. And, again, Justin, Paulina, Michael, I want to give you a big thank you for being here with us, for being honest and authentic and genuine in your learnings with us, and really driving our theme home today. I want to take a moment to invite our wonderful audience to take a moment and just put in the chat box a key takeaway or gratitude for your learning, to give our lovely faculty some resonance and response. You three have just been so wonderful. I know this is close to the final session of the day, so really appreciate you being here with us. And our audience, many who have stuck around since this morning, so thank you, thank you, thank you. Justin, Michael, Paulina, I invite you to see the feedback you're getting in the chat box the next few minutes. I believe we have about 5 minutes for a mini break. We invite everyone in our audience, our faculty, our support staff, to stretch, take a breather. We'll be welcoming back Candace Valenzuela, who provided our opening keynote today. She was just awesome. She's going to come back and close out our learning. She'll circle back to the second half of our theme, grief sensitivity, where are we going? After that, a gentle reminder that we do have Monique Menahan leading us in an optional body-mind practice at the end of our day. Really encourage you to stick around for that. It'll be a wonderful way to help ourselves integrate our learning. Again, Justin, Paulina, Michael, thank you. Thank you, gracias. Appreciate you all.